Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for joining me today. Today I'm going to be covering a subject that I've been asked to look at by quite a number of people ever since I started looking or examining the topic of Gnosticism. For anyone who's watching for the first time and isn't sure what Gnosticism is, well, it's the early Christian belief system that began to emerge at around the same time that the canonized Bible was being compiled. There is some evidence to suggest that Gnosticism or aspects of the belief system actually predate the version of Christianity that follows the teachings of the Bible. That, of course, is debated in certain circles. But when something happened so many thousands of years ago, we can't really be sure what came first, the chicken or the egg. What we've been able to do is carbon date some of the Gnostic writings and establish that the versions that were written and found in the Nag Hammadi library date back to at least 2 AD. So 2 years potentially after that zero date in which Christ is, or Jesus is expected to have been born. The Nag Hammadi library was an accidental occurrence during the 1940s when a building crew happened to stumble across some clay pots buried in the ground of their building site. And those clay pots had scrolls in them of writings. The pots contained previously unknown texts, a selection of anonymous gospels, poems, letters, and other types of writings, including some of Plato, the philosopher Plato's writings. Some of the writings appeared to have been Greek translations of what was likely to be much older Coptic writings. And the gospel that we're going to be looking at today is one of those writings. So today I'm going to be covering the Gospel of Judas. The authorship of the gospel is anonymous, but it claims to be the true account of Jesus and his relationship to his disciple Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot is one of the most infamous figures in Christian history. In the canonized texts, which basically means the Gospels and other writings that were collectively voted in by cardinals to form part of what we now call the Bible, Judas is known primarily as the disciple who betrayed Jesus in exchange for a measly 30 pieces of silver. In the Bible, the betrayal by Judas directly led to the arrest and the crucifixion of Jesus. However, in Gnostic writings, particularly the Gospel of Judas, the role of Judas is drastically different. And that different role is also supported by other Gospels within Gnosticism as well, which I'm going to cover at a later time. But for today, I actually wanted to take a look at the Gospel of Judas. Rather than being a traitor, Judas is described in Gnosticism to be the most enlightened of all of the disciples of Jesus. Judas is described as being the one who had a divine mission to fulfill, which he indeed successfully did fulfill, apparently. So before we get too far into the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, let's spend a few minutes comparing by talking about how Judas appears in the Bible, in the canonized texts of Christianity. It helps us to get a really clear comparison. So Judas was one of 12 disciples of Jesus. He's referred to in the Bible as either Judas or sometimes Judas Iscariot or simply as Iscariot. It all depends on which book we're reading in the Bible. He is also sometimes referred to as the brother of James, which is interesting, and that becomes apparent later in today's show. In the Bible, Judas performs the task of being responsible for handling the money by which Jesus and the disciples live by. This suggests that he was trusted with money and that he had a position of responsibility relevant to money. So he was the disciple that was chosen by Jesus to manage the finances of the group. In the 4 canonized Gospels of the Bible, so that includes the books of Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark, Judas makes a fateful decision. He agrees to hand Jesus over to the authorities in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. But we need to be really specific here because the Bible is very specific, and this is something that is often overlooked when it comes to the canonized story of Judas. To be clear, the Bible states that Judas approached the chief priests and struck a deal with those priests. So the priests are the ones who wanted to get rid of Jesus. That's often forgotten. You can't strike a deal with people who don't want what you're offering. So the priests were willing to pay Judas 30 pieces of silver if he allowed them to get access to Jesus so that Jesus could be arrested and crucified. But somehow the priests are not the villains here. Judas is the villain. So that's just something to keep in mind. So there are lots of references to this in the Bible, but here are a few for us to be able to examine as examples. And for the geeks out there who want to know where I'm getting my information from, I'm using the New King James Version of the Bible for all of these biblical references. So in the book of Matthew 26, chapter 26, 14 to 16, it describes how Judas approached the chief priests and struck the deal. In Mark chapter 14, 10, 11, and in Luke chapter 22, verses 3 to 6, there are descriptions of how Satan entered into Judas, which is what caused him to betray Jesus. So he was possessed by Satan at the time. And in the book of John, chapter 13, verse 27, it's explicitly stated that Satan influenced Judas during the Last Supper. Now, the other day, I posted a question in the community tab of the Ellie Dreams Down Under channel, which had just a simple yes or no answer. And my question was, would you buy a house that was numbered 13? That's it. That's all I wanted to know. The results were really interesting, but I had a reason for asking. I was trying to figure out what percentage of people might have a superstitious view of the number 13. There are a lot of people who are afraid of the number 13. There's even movies and books about how evil 13 is. For example, the movie Friday 13th, that horror film. And actually, I have a story about that from when the movie first came out. When Friday 13th first came out, I actually went to see the movie with my boyfriend at the time. And I managed to completely embarrass myself in front of all of the people in the cinema. I was so afraid of that entire movie that I kept squealing and screaming. And even before anything scary had happened, I mean, all they had to do was just look funny and I'd scream. And people in the cinema were beginning to think of me as a kind of additional free entertainment by the end of the movie. And they started laughing at me every time I'd jump or scream or whatever. It was very embarrassing. And when I wasn't squealing and screaming at things that weren't even scary, I was sitting with my eyes covered and muttering things like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, because I couldn't handle the movie. I couldn't handle it. I've never really been a scary movie kind of person. I try to stay away from horror movies, even now. I love supernatural, but I don't like horror. So I don't mind a supernatural thriller, but a horror just takes me a bit too down. Yeah, it crosses the line for me. It just doesn't let me, no, I'm afraid not. And so I'm such an embarrassment to myself. I just cannot bear to watch them. So no, there's no point me even trying. But anyway, the results of my community tab, getting back onto the topic, were that there were around 2,000 people who voted in that poll. And of that 2,000 or so people who voted, 79% of them said that they would have no trouble at all buying a house that was number 13. And then 21% said that they would not buy a house if it was numbered 13. There you go, 21%. People generally didn't give any reason why they wouldn't buy a number 13 house, which I think is interesting. But the reasons why people said that they would buy a house were often centered around how they have found the number 13 to actually be quite lucky rather than unlucky. But also they referred to things like numerology and the number 4 as it appears in tarot because Obviously, numbers 1 and 3 added up equals 4. And the number 4 in tarot relates to stability and security. So it's the perfect number for a house, which represents stability and security as well. Anyway, for those who don't know why the number 13 has a bad reputation among certain people, well, it's because of Judas, and that's the reason why I'm bringing it up. During the Last Supper, Judas was the final disciple to attend that supper. So Jesus was there along with 11 of the disciples, which equals 12. And then when Judas showed up, that made him number 13. And that is why the number 13 is often considered to be an unlucky number, because it's associated with Judas as the 13th attendee at the Last Supper. And the Last Supper is where Jesus addresses Judas and claims to know that Judas is about to betray him. Well, there is some kind of disagreement among Mark and Matthew and Luke and John about what actually took place. So Mark, Matthew and Luke, they all claim that Jesus told all of the disciples that one of them would betray him. But in the book of John, Jesus is quoted as having dipped bread into wine and then handing it to Judas and saying, "Do what you have to do quickly," after which Judas immediately left the supper and went off to betray Jesus. So it was a bit more intimate and a direct communication in the book of John, which is kind of weird, really. After all, weren't the disciples all meant to follow the word of Jesus? So if Judas is being told to do something by Jesus, wasn't that his number one thing, to actually follow the word of Jesus and do what he was told? And Judas just did what he was told. Jesus said, "Go off and do what you need to do quickly." And so he did. Is it a betrayal to do what you're told? I just thought that was kind of very interesting. I'm just saying this because it is one of the reasons why the Bible is such a fascination for me. It's like telling a dog to sit and then reprimanding the dog because it followed your command. That kind of thing seems to happen a lot in the Bible. There are also conflicts in the Bible about what Judas did after Jesus was condemned to death. So in the book of Matthew, chapter 27, 3-5, it explains that Judas experienced deep remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the priests, and then he went and he hanged himself in shame. But in the book of Luke, chapter 1:18, it says that Judas kept the 30 pieces of silver and he used it to buy himself some real estate. Very different. He purchased a field with the money, and then somehow he died because he fell down and burst open in a kind of a supernatural kind of way. So very, very different. So in mainstream Christianity, which of course is generally informed by the canonized Bible, Jesus is a cautionary figure. He is represented by the number 13. There we go, which is a number that's feared by many people, sometimes without people even realizing that that's the reason why they're apprehensive about the number. And some theologians even go so far as to claim that Judas was possessed by Satan and was therefore evil, and so he acted in understandably evil ways. But there are some holes. So firstly, Judas was the one who managed the money, as I said before. So if he was going to demonstrate greed, why would he negotiate with priests for silver when he already had all of this money at his disposal that he was already entrusted with? Why not just leave with that money? Plus, the disciples don't seem to agree with each other about whether Jesus knew he was being betrayed by Judas, or whether he even instructed Judas to fulfill a task that ultimately led to the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus. And they also don't seem to agree on what happened to Judas later. They just know that he died or he disappeared. But then again, everyone dies or disappears eventually, don't they? So it's just a bit strange. So that was Judas according to the Bible. So let's go and take a look at what the book of Judas says in Gnosticism. So once again, if you're interested in knowing where I'm getting my information from, I have downloaded the full English translation of the Gospel of Judas from a website that's called spiritual-truth.com, and that should be written up on the screen for you to see. So it's spiritualtruth.com. I normally read my Gnostic texts on a different website, but which is gnosis.org, but they didn't have the Gospel of Judas on record for some reason, which is really peculiar. They've got everything else. It was a bit strange they didn't have Judas. I had to fish around the internet and compare various different translations that exist on a variety of different academic and non-academic sites. And I finally decided to use this version and this translation from the Spiritual Truth website because it contains the same translation as many academically published versions of the gospel. Some of those interpretations or discussions in academia are linking back to the spiritualtruth.com website, which is the reason why I'm using that translation. So the translation that I'm using is the 2006 English translation by Marvin Mayer, who is my favorite Gnostic translator, by the way. And Marvin Mayer collaborated with 3 other people. Their names are Rodolphe Kasser, Gregor Wurst, and Francois Goddard. I happen to really like Mayer translations of the Gnostic texts, because Mayer has a really wonderful way of translating the most easy to understand English version, but he also seems to find a way to also capture the emotional depth of those translations. It's a nice blend between being practical and having this emotive element to it as well. So the Gospel of Judas claims to be the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas. The conversation is said to have occurred a few days before Passover. Sadly, there are lots of sections missing in this gospel in places scattered all over the document. So I'm just working with what is available. I think it had been quite severely degraded, particularly as we get further down towards the good bit at the end, which is a real shame. Anyway, the first thing that the gospel describes is how Jesus begins to perform miracles in front of the disciples. He does this in order to teach them about deeper hidden truths that exist in reality. He sometimes appears as a child, and then sometimes he appears as an adult. And he seems to be shape-shifting according to the gospel in order to demonstrate that nature isn't as simple as what is traditionally believed. He demonstrates to them that life is just a mere perception, a bit like a simulation theory, the kind of thing that we're talking about in the current day. So it's like life is a simulation that's controlled by the human mind and human perceptions. That sounds really familiar, doesn't it? It's like we're debating these very same things and talking about these very same things thousands of years after the Gospel of Judas was written. So the disciples become very confused because Jesus starts to laugh at how they follow religious doctrine. And Jesus kind of has a bit of edge to him in the Gospel of Judas. You know, he laughs at people a lot. He kind of makes fun of things, which is very, very different to what you see in the canonized Bible. So Jesus is laughing at the disciples and laughing at the fact that they follow religion and religious rituals and doctrine. He explains to them that their worship is not really theirs. It's something that is being used to control them, and it's being controlled by a religious style of God that is dictating to them how it wants to be perceived. But that perception is contrived and it's not real. It's just a method to control them. This passage immediately hints at the idea that Jesus is opposed to religious doctrine. And think of all the religions that have been created as a result of Jesus. This is something that also comes up in the book of Thomas in Gnosticism as well. In Thomas, Jesus outwardly claims that the church is lying to people and that the faith that religious people have is a way in which to control them and to control their thinking. So most of the disciples don't seem to understand what Jesus is saying, but Judas does. He is the only one who recognizes that Jesus comes from a higher divine realm called Barbello. Now, or some people like to refer to Barbello as Barbelo. It's up to you. You know what? I don't think she'd care either way. I've done an episode on Barbello, who is the first emanation from the divine source. The very first thing that created itself. It created itself and then it gave life to Barbello. And Barbello has subsequently been giving life to all things since then. And Judas immediately understands that Jesus comes from her. This realization leaves Judas feeling unworthy of being even in the presence of someone with the divinity of Jesus. Jesus sees that Judas appears to stand alone in his understanding of the truth, and he addresses Judas and tells him that he will be replaced as the 12th disciple. He will be given great knowledge about reality, but he will have to pay a very steep price for that knowledge. And Judas will need to suffer in order to fulfill his purpose. So Judas tries to find out more information, but at that point, Jesus leaves all of the disciples. He disappears and he returns sometime later. And when they ask him where he has been, he says that he's been at a higher and holier generation. Those are his words. It's a different generation. Jesus was explaining to the disciples that he had just returned from a place that no mortal can ever exist. The way it's described to the disciples makes it sound as though it's an ethereal type of place with no physical form, where angels might live, but it may even be above the angels. But it is also a place where humans are not enlightened or ascended enough to reside. Jesus refers to this place as a generation, which is superior to humans and celestial beings. Now, superior to humans and celestial beings. And this, I think, is something that is kind of interesting, and we're going to look at this more closely in a moment. The statement by Jesus appears to be a kind of a direct challenge to traditional religious ideas about salvation and divine order. It's like there's a place that exists that is beyond anything that we can visualize. The disciples tell Jesus that while he was gone, they had been having very upsetting dreams. They were dreaming about a temple that was filled with 12 priests who were performing disturbing rituals of sacrifice and lawlessness. Jesus responds and tells them that they are the priests that they're dreaming about. They're dreaming about their own religious practices, which are misguided. He says that they are worshipping a false god and are being misled into a religious doctrine that keeps them busy with things like sacrifice and other types of rituals, because it's a system that's designed to lead them astray. Jesus also tells the disciples that in the last days, so we're talking, end times period now, so during the end times, false religious leaders will face shame and divine reckoning. They will be the ones who claim to serve God, but in fact they're acting in error and will ultimately be exposed. And when they're exposed, the truth will be revealed. So that will be part of the revealing of the truth. The revelation will be the exposure of these priests that claim to serve God, but are actually working in error, in misguided error. So that is the final judgment according to the Gospel of Judas. It's not when Christ returns and has a big battle with the Antichrist. The final judgment is when a revelation of truth appears. And that revelation of truth will demonstrate once and for all that religion has been used to control humanity and that it is preaching a false faith. And that's something. Interestingly, when I've been doing research outside of the Gnostic Gospels, whether it be actual research for the show on a variety of different topics, or whether it be the tarot readings that I do, I'm getting very similar type of response, that there's going to be a revelation of information that picks us up off the perceptive path that we're on and kind of places us into something brand new. And I'm not the only one. This is coming out of the UAP disclosure discussions. It's coming out of other notable figures who have had sightings or experiences that are starting to sound very credible. There are a lot of very intuitively open people of kind of long-standing credibility who are saying the same thing, that information is coming. We don't know where it's coming from, whether it's, as Edgar Cayce said, that it's coming from hidden, a hidden stash of information that's buried somewhere beneath the paw of the Sphinx, or whether it's the revelation coming from a discovery of a lost civilization and the truth that's contained in that discovery. Who knows? There might be something like another type of Nag Hammadi library that is accidentally dug up during construction one day, somewhere in Egypt or somewhere else in the world. We don't know, but there's been a lot of prediction and foretelling for a very long time that we are living under a misinterpretation of truth, and that the revelation of truth is going to pick us up quite quickly and suddenly and set us on a new path. So there you go. But that's not all. There's actually more. And strangely, it appears to confirm some of the suspicions that I've had about the Bible's translations overall. So throughout the Old Testament, but particularly in the book of Genesis, God is a word that is used as an overlay. God is used on top of the original words, such as Yahweh, Elohim, El Shaddai, and other types of words that exist, that describe beings that have been assumed to all be a single God. If you were to go back to the book of Genesis and retranslate it from the original ancient Hebrew text, or ancient Greek text, or Coptic, or whatever it is, if you take it word for word and retranslate it and double check the entire thing, you'd find that there are many instances where it actually appears that what's being described is a kind of a battle that's taking place between a number of different entities for control over humanity and the earth. Not just a single God, but different entities with different names. This is very similar to what appears to be here in the book of Judas. Now remember that the book of Judas has been carbon dated to at least the year 2 AD. In fact, I understand that it may be even older than that. So it may even be older than what we understand to be the birth date of Jesus, which would be 0, the year 0. And this is a concept that I cover in yet another episode of the show, which I'll make sure you have access to in the description for today's show. The episode that I'm talking about is the one about Share International and their belief in the fact that Jesus and Christ are actually two different people, or perhaps two different entities, that they're not the same. So I will make sure that that's accessible in the description for today's show. So returning to the book of Judas, Jesus tells the disciples to stop sacrificing for the sake of their religious worship. He says that the pious, the ones who are considered to be the most holy in the religious world, are killing cattle, laying claim to children, abstaining from sex or having sex, or dictating who can have sex and how they can have sex. And they're setting lots of rules up for everyone to follow. But none of those rules or rituals are actually anything to do with the truth about existence or creation. Isn't that strange? Some of the examples, so killing cattle, laying claim to children, abstaining from sex, or designing and dictating who can and under what circumstances can have sex is very specific, and also setting up other rules. That it actually is a distraction for whatever is, and it has nothing to do with the actual truth about existence or creation, and that it's been kind of set up. This is what's really, really interesting. The way that it's described in the book of Judas, Jesus says that the whole thing has been set up by celestial influences that are leading humanity astray. Those are the words, celestial influences that are leading humanity astray. So what does that mean? What is a celestial influence? Does that mean it's a celestial entity? Are we talking, extraterrestrial entity? Alien entity of some kind? So the way that it's described, it sounds like Jesus is telling his disciples that celestial influences are not representative of true spiritual understanding. So he's creating a separation between spiritual knowledge and understanding and sources of influence that come from a celestial place. They're two different things. And the spiritual understanding is the truth, and the celestial influence is a lie. That's very specific. So spiritual understanding, according to the gospel, is where the higher generation resides, that place that Jesus had just come back from when he addresses the disciples. But no celestial influence is high enough to reside there. And that would indicate that there's a limit to the celestial influence, which makes you think that it is a being of some kind. It's a celestial being that isn't high enough to be able to reside in the higher generation. And what that seems to indicate is that there are at least three different types or three different levels of existence or life that are being described in the Gospel of Judas. And the lowest is the collection of life that resides on earth. Now that could be subdivided into a variety of lower forms and higher forms, but there's a group or a collective, which is the lowest collective that is earthbound. And so I guess that includes humanity for sure, but it may also include animals and things like that. I don't know, but that's the human kind of level. And then there's another level which appears to be celestial, but it's not angelic. And so we're talking about something even higher than that. And that means that middle of the row level sounds a little bit like aliens or extraterrestrial or other planetary type of beings. It sounds like it, doesn't it? And so that's now where the Gospel of Judas crosses over into something else that I looked at some time ago, and that was the story of Marshall V.N. Summers and the Allies of Humanity episode that I did. I think I did that about a year ago, where Marshall V.N. Summers claims to have been visited by an angelic presence that was trying to use him as a vehicle to warn humanity that extraterrestrial forces exist. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good, but there are the ones that are not so good that the warning is about, and that they're trying to trick us into letting them take over so that they ultimately just take over and use us as slaves or a workforce for what they want. and that because of some kind of intergalactic policy framework, they can't force their way in. But what they can do is they can convince us that it's our idea, and that's what they're slowly doing. Now, I'm not giving credence to Marshall V. and Summers specifically, but it's funny, the Gospel of Judas is a really tricky little book. It kind of seems to be poking fingers into other things that I've been looking at that seem really unconventional. And it's remarkable because this gospel was written more than 2,000 years ago, and it still appears to be something that aligns with current debate and fascination and interest. So it's really fascinating, isn't it, how it all seems to interplay. At first glance, all of the subjects that I've been looking at look unrelated to each other. But when you keep an open mind and you just keep sort of scratching away, trying to see where there's overlap, you suddenly begin to see that a lot of what seemed to be unrelated is starting to look very, very related. It's just about trying to figure out exactly what that means. So anyway, Jesus says that the disciples must stop following religious rituals because when they do that, they are blunting or distracting themselves from the true spiritual teachings that are present inside them. He tells them that each of them has their own star, and those are the words that he uses. He says, each of you have your own star, which I think sounds really sweet. It kind of means that each of the disciples, and by extension each of us humans, has our own unique and individual destiny that is linked to the stars. Jesus says to stop struggling with him, just to find our own way in the way that is most natural, without any kind of structured belief system pushing us unnaturally in a contrived direction. It just sounds so liberating, doesn't it? It sounds really free. And I don't think it's an invitation. It doesn't sound like an invitation to be as crazy as you like and to express yourself, but, in ways that kind of make you stand out. It's much softer than that. It seems as though what Jesus is saying is to stop trying to be anything. Just be. And if you just be and just believe and live and follow the path that is the most natural for you without trying to appear to be anything, without trying to follow anything in particular, that's when you will gain that knowledge, that gnosis, that enlightens you and helps you to find the light within you. I think it's very beautiful and very gentle. So safe and gentle and non-confrontational. It doesn't set any kind of expectation on people. It just allows them to exist, which I think takes a lot of pressure off, doesn't it? So at this point, Judas shares a vision that he has had. He claims that in the vision, he's being persecuted by the other disciples, and he feels alienated by them. Jesus replies by telling Judas that his star has been led astray. Those are the words. His star has been led astray. And that he has a fate which is different to the others. He is the 13th disciple, which means that generations will curse him because of stories that they will hear about him. But ultimately, Judas will rule over the others because he is separated from the group and has a unique path to follow. That's interesting. It's very frustrating at this point because it starts to get at its most interesting. And unfortunately, at this point, there's about 17 consecutive lines of text that are all corroded and missing. And so I think that they contain probably nuggets of wonderful information that I would have liked to have known, but that information is missing. But what appears after that is a line from Jesus that I'm going to read out to you. It says the following, and I'm quoting, "The souls of every human generation will die. When these people, however, have completed the time of the kingdom and the Spirit leaves them, Their bodies will die, but their souls will be alive, and they will be taken up. What this seems to indicate is that everyone is saved. So, according to the canonized Bible and the religious version of Christianity, not everyone is saved. Maybe, after the final battle, then eventually, and all the tribulations and everything, eventually everyone else shows up in the kingdom of God. But what the Gospel of Judas says is something different. It says that the soul is eternal, and the human body is a vehicle for our time on earth. We wear it like an outfit, like a suit. It's the human body that we wear that allows us to exist in this earthly plane. But we will always return back because our soul is eternal. And so we're only borrowing our human body for the time that we're here on earth. This is the same message that comes from the mystical book of Zohar in the Kabbalistic faith. And it's also what appears to be said in other Gnostic texts like the Book of Mary and the Book of John, which both appear to show that our human existence is a physical version of something much more transcendent. We are essentially unkillable, but we may come back and we may come and go onto earth, taking a variety of different forms with each iteration of ourselves. Jesus then talks about the great invisible realm that is led by a self-generated entity. So the book of John refers to this self-generated entity as it just calls it the One. And this is the source of all creation. It is the first thing that created itself, and then the One also created other celestial beings, some of whom might even be the alien beings that created our religious rituals in order to distract us and thereby control us. So Jesus is talking about a cosmic hierarchy that seems to exist, which is very different to what is referred to in the Bible. Just like in the book of John, which is a complex book, and it took me 2 episodes to cover the book of John, the book of Judas describes a system of divine luminaries, eons, angels, and other beings that that kind of form a mystical structure or order of existence. Included are characters like Seth and Sophia and others who play a large role in the Gnostic teachings. Jesus begins describing how the hierarchy of the cosmos was created. The cosmos is actually a reference to the various entities and beings that make up the angels and other celestial beings that exist in Gnosticism. And then Jesus also talks about Yaldabaoth, the deeply flawed son of Sophia, and also an equally flawed partner called Suckless, and how they both lead to the creation of Adam and Eve. Now, I've covered the creation of Adam and Eve and Yaldabaoth in quite a lot of detail in my Gnostic episode. I think it was the Book of John episode that talks about the creation of Adam and Eve, and also the creation of Sophia and Yaldabaoth, who was deeply flawed and went walkabout, went missing to create his own perfect divine image of himself. He's a bit of a weird one, Yaldabaoth. And then if that hasn't already interested you, then it starts to get very interesting from this point on, because Jesus starts to explain that every human being is on loan from somewhere in the spiritual realm. Yeah, we are each placed here on loan to live for a while. And those are the words that are used. The word loan is used by Jesus. So we're placed here to live on loan for a while. And when we die, some of us ascend to eternal realms, but then some of us are subject to the rulers of chaos. Now, weirdly, I think it was just a day or so ago, I did a tarot reading on this, which said the very same thing. My reading was asking, What happens to those who are left behind? And that's exactly what the cards appeared to say. The cards seem to indicate that there was a split between those who learn to ascend through valuing the collective spirit and those who remain behind to continue in another cycle of church age until they also manage to figure it out, and then they get to ascend one day too. But they may have to repeat multiple cycles, and the cycle appears to be where you have to live in this religious doctrine age, which is the age of church and church belief system, until you figure out how to get out of it. And the way to get out of it is to learn the lessons that allow you to value the collective spirit and ascend or transcend beyond that which is physical. So that's what we're meant to do when we're here on earth. That's what Jesus explains is our mission. Our mission here on earth is to defy the oppressive forces of our ritualistic existence and to find the spiritual knowledge that's within each of us that allows us to ascend. Knowledge is presented to us as a divine gift that resides within each of us. Even though it's only mentioned briefly, and there is no further mention of it in this book, there's also a very quick call out or cameo mention of Seth being Christ. So that's all that basically occurs in the gospel, is it makes mention of Seth, the character Seth in Gnosticism, actually being Christ. And so it appears that Christ is also considered to be separate from Jesus in the Gospel of Judas. I'm going to look at Seth in more detail in another episode in the future, I think. I just wanted to mention that there was a brief call out to Seth in the Gospel and what it might mean. So I have attached to the description in today's show my episode on Share International, which is a group that's been around for a long time that also believes that Jesus and Christ are two different entities. And it seems that this Gospel of Judas is hinting at the same thing. So the next section of text in the Gospel is where Judas actually demonstrates himself to be a hero rather than a traitor. Jesus says to Judas that he will release Jesus from the body that contains him. And this will allow Jesus to transcend that body and become a spiritual being once again. Because Jesus appears to also be trapped in a physical state like everyone else, which is kind of interesting. The way that he describes it is that, and I'm quoting here, that Judas will surpass all others and sacrifice the man that clothes me. That is quoted. So sacrifice the man that clothes me. The man that clothes Jesus is the body of the man that the spirit of Jesus resides in or is trapped inside. And of course, it's very frustrating, but this section has so many gaps in it from areas that were destroyed. But let me read as much of it to you as I can so that you can get a sense for what it's saying. And so this is a quote. And it says, "But you will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Already your horn has been raised, your wrath has been kindled, your star has shone brightly, and your heart has... ... I think if that word that was following the heart was found, it would open up so much understanding. It's so frustrating. So I'll read it to you again without all my frustration. It says, "But you will exceed all others, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Already your horn has been raised, your wrath has been kindled, your star has shone brightly, and your heart has..." something. So frustrating. Okay. So the way that the book of Judas ends is that Jesus speaks about how the current ruler of earth will be destroyed. he refers to us as the great generation of Adam that will be elevated to the stars, and that we originated from the stars, and so we will be returning home once our ruler has been defeated. Now I want to refer you to what appeared to be a little weird, but that's the reason why I invited them on, because it doesn't sound quite so weird when you take something like the book of Judas into account. Recently, I did an episode where I interviewed the chief rabbi for the Raelian movement, and the Raelians are largely considered to be a cult that is pro-love, pro-technology, and believes that humans are a generation that were created by a previous generation who were created by a previous generation, and that each of these generations resided in various different places in the cosmos, and that we will one day become the generation that creates our own generation of others in our own likeness. Now, the Gospel of Judas is hinting at the same thing, because the words that are being used here, let me just return back to it, is, and this is a quote, the Gospel of Judas, written 2,000 years ago. In this Gospel, Jesus says, and I quote, that we are the great generation of Adam. So we are the generation of humans coming from the creation of Adam. And so the previous generation is implied. And the future generation is also implied. Because if we're a generation, that means that other generations must also exist. And that directly coincides with what the Raelians say. They say that we were created by a generation of interplanetary beings or celestial influences that created us in their likeness. And we will one day create another generation in our likeness. When you put that together with the whole, sort of multi-universe, non-linear time framework or space-time framework, it opens up so many possibilities of what might be happening here. It must be noted also that I really love how Jesus says in the gospel that when the ruler of earth is destroyed, which might, coincide with the Bible or be translated by the Bible to be this Antichrist element. I don't know. But when that ruler is destroyed, the great generation of Adam, which is us, will be elevated to the stars. And that we originated from there. And so it's our home. But first, the ruler has to be defeated. So then Jesus directs Judas to move forward with the truth that he's been told. He points to a cloud and tells Judas to recognize his moment of ascension. And Judas does this, and the cloud carries him, so he's carried to this luminous cloud. This appears to be the moment when Judas fulfills his divine purpose, which is not specified in the same way that it is in the Bible. It just basically is stated that Judas acknowledges the cloud, which is luminous, and he is transported to the cloud and disappears into the cloud. The disciples are watching, and when Judas disappears, they hear a voice coming from the cloud. But frustratingly, its message is unknown because this section of text is very heavily corrupted. Very frustrating, very frustrating. I think the scroll must have been rolled in such a way where the further down the text was, the more exposed to the elements it was, because it gets worse and worse as you go down the text. So it is very frustrating. But a mysterious voice comes from the clouds, and that would have been imparting a very important message as well. We don't know what that message is, so it's just too fragmented. Judas is not seen again, but the very last section of text in the Gospel speaks about how the religious priests begin to grow wary of Judas and Jesus. Some of them want very much to arrest and kill Jesus because his views are considered to be dangerously revolutionary. They are afraid of the power of his words. And so that's basically it. That's the Gospel of Judas. According to the Gospel, there is no actual betrayal that occurs against Jesus by Judas. But one thing does stand out a lot when you read the translation. Throughout the text, the Gospel describes that Jesus is laughing as he's speaking. At many moments, his disciples ask him why he's laughing at them. And he keeps telling them that he isn't laughing at them. He's laughing at how misguided the religious teachings are of the church, with all of its meaningless sacrifices and other rituals, and how the church contains a lot of people who spend a lot of time telling everyone what all the rules are, when in fact there are no rules. There is only one thing, and that is the knowledge that exists inside each person. But for as long as we're following the direction of religious doctrine that was created to keep us oppressed and distracted, then we will be prevented from finding that knowledge. Now, I have to stop for a moment, because what is the definition of the religious doctrine exactly? Does it mean structured traditional religions like Judaism and Islam and Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and the rest of it? Or does it mean anything that follows a preconceived idea? Because we also have other types of spiritual belief systems that have become quite popular and almost trendy in the modern day that may not aspire to religious frameworks, but may also kind of present themselves as a kind of a structure that might be oppressing us and distracting us as well. What the gospel appears to be saying is that we need to stop in order to find our truth, to find that light that leads to the gnosis or the knowledge that allows us to ascend as individuals. We need to simply be. We need to not ascribe to any kind of belief system specifically. We just need to be. And so once I was reading this gospel, I was thinking to myself, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that, believing anything can get in the way of true knowledge? So it's just something to keep in mind. And of course, we'll scratch away more as time goes on and see if we can get even deeper in this. Also, there was some early references in the gospel to Judas and James being brothers. It wasn't clear whether this was psychological brothers. These are the two disciples, whether they're not psychological, whether they're physiological brothers, so whether they are actually biological brothers to each other, or whether they're spiritual brothers. I know that in Gnosticism, brotherhood is something that might just be a spiritual brotherhood, but it may also be physiological or biological as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. And in the Bible, James and Jesus are referred to as being brothers as well. This comes up particularly in the New Testament. So it makes me wonder whether Jesus and James and Judas were, given they're all J names as well, whether they were all brothers. I don't know. I mean, there is speculation that Jesus and James were. There is a reference in the Gospel of Judas of James and Judas being brothers. And so it's just sort of something to think about. It's unclear. And I guess it doesn't really matter for now anyway. Perhaps it will become clearer as we scratch the surface. So, Gospel of Judas, a very interesting book, very heavily damaged, which is a shame, but still very enlightening. Judas is said to be living in the clouds or to have ascended because he's fulfilled his purpose right there in front of everyone. And it was foretold that he would be villainized for fulfilling his purpose. Perhaps, it goes to show that people are naturally just very jealous. I remember in the book of Mary, something very similar happened. Mary stated to the disciples that Jesus had told her secrets, told her truths when they were alone. And the disciples turned on Mary when she said that because they were envious of the special relationship that she had with Jesus. There's also a possibility that the issue with Judas was not that he betrayed Jesus, but that he was acknowledged as being special in some way. And so the disciples turned on him. They were jealous of Mary, and perhaps they were also jealous of Judas. I just sort of wonder whether the stories about Judas that appear in the canonized texts of the Bible were made up to compensate for the disciples' jealousy. The reason why is because, it seems kind of curious and a bit suspicious that Mark and Matthew, Luke and John all seem to have an idea that Judas was a wrongdoer, but they can't seem to agree on why he was a wrongdoer and whether he was possessed by Satan or not, or whether he just got greedy and why he would betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver when he was already in charge of all the money all of the time anyway. And did he really kill himself, or did he just explode supernaturally in a field somewhere? Did he give the money back to the priest, or did he keep it and buy real estate? You see, they just don't seem to agree. As with all of the Gnostic texts, it just seems to make more sense to hear a story about a man who stood out because he'd found a way to access the knowledge or the gnosis earlier than the others. And so he ascended. He had fulfilled his purpose. And the ones who were left behind became bitter. And so they spread stories about him that resulted in people being afraid, 21% of the population being afraid to buy a house that was numbered 13. It sounds very human, doesn't it? And it also puts this question of number 13 to rest. Another enlightening Gnostic book. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. I have. I really enjoy looking at the Gnostic texts. There are plenty more to come over the course of time, and I'm planning to get through them all. You're watching Ellie Dreams Down Under. Thank you for joining me today, and thanks for being part of my exploration. Let me know what you think about today's episode and also what other types of topics you'd like me to cover on the show. Nothing's off limits, I love to explore, and particularly if it helps us to understand our reality and where we could potentially be going in the future and where we've come from. And whatever it is we need to know, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave a comment with your suggestion. Don't forget to be in the running for a free private personal reading with me. Just include the words good karma, should be right above there on the screen, in your comment. When we reach 50,000 subscribers, someone who has written good karma in their comment is going to be randomly chosen to get that free private personal reading. Thank you for supporting the channel with Patreon membership, YouTube channel membership, and PayPal donations. Every bit helps. And a special thank you to my wonderful, loyal subscribers who pop in to watch my videos every single day. Sometimes all the way to the end. It really helps. You guys are my rocks. Don't forget to subscribe and comment. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams.